Welcome to the next lesson in this real estate case study. We will be going into part 4, the property proforma outlined in the case study document here. Overall, this will be a pretty simple and straightforward lesson with only one or two things that are a bit tricky. So we're not going to go into all the same tricky formulas and complex looking formulas that we went through last time. Instead, this will be pretty simple. And the main difference really compared to some of the previous proformas that we've seen is that this one is on a monthly basis. Also, this one will have a construction period and an operating period, so we need to do a check to make sure that we actually have rental income before we start linking in these formulas. This lesson will consist of 3 main parts. In part 1, we'll go through the monthly income and expenses and how to pull in those formulas. Then in part 2, we'll show you how to create the expense reimbursement formula. This one is a bit tricky, although it's still easier than some of the formulas that we went through in the previous lesson. We need to do this second because we need to get the property operating expenses and property operating taxes before we can figure out these expense reimbursements. And then finally, in part 3, we will calculate the net operating income and adjusted net operating income. And to do that, we'll have to look at the reserves, the capital costs paid from the reserves, and the additions and changes to the reserves each year. So let's start with part 1 first and go through the base rental income, all the other items that contribute to effective gross income, and then look at the operating expenses after that. With the base rental income here, the first thing we have to check is to make sure that we're beyond the end of the construction end date. So I'll do that first and check our date against the construction end date. And if we are, then we take the base rental income from the first tenant, add the base rental income from the second tenant, and then add it from the third tenant. But we can't quite stop there because we also have to factor in the fact that a small percentage of the space is not currently occupied and will not be occupied by the time this finishes. 41% plus 29% is 70%, plus 25% is 95%. So about 5% of the rentable square meters here will not be occupied. To factor that in, we'll take the total rentable square meters in the property, and then we will subtract the rentable square meters for tenant 1. We'll anchor the E part of the E45 so the column doesn't shift around. We'll subtract them for tenant number 2, and we'll subtract them for tenant number 3. We have that. We need to assign some type of rental value to this unoccupied space. So to keep things simple, we're just going to use the value for tenant number 1 right here. This is on an annual basis, so we need to convert to months. So we'll divide by the months in the year, 12. We have that. Now, if we're not yet beyond the end of the construction end date, we're going to say 0 for the second part of this formula. And so we have that. Now, these other items are pretty simple because we already calculated them above. We just have to link them in and add them up for each tenant. So the absorption and turnover vacancy, we can add up for tenant number 1, tenant number 2, and tenant number 3. And concessions and free rent, we can do pretty much the same thing right there. For the expense reimbursements, we don't even have this calculated yet, but I'm going to link to it because we will get to it right after this. So we'll get to the expense reimbursements for tenant number 1 and for tenant number 2. We don't have any for tenant number 3 because tenant number 3 is using a gross lease, not a triple net lease. We can then add these up. And then for the general vacancy, we can actually take this base rental income formula from above and we can just modify it a bit. And we can take out the very first part and just keep the second part right here, where we have the rentable square meters. We subtract the rentable square meters that are actually occupied. We multiply by the base rental income in this year and divide by the months. And if we're not yet at the end of construction or beyond it, then we're just going to say 0. So let's sum up everything here and then copy this across. Our property first comes online at the end of April 2018, so the first month where we have rent is May 2018. And if you keep going, you'll see how this works, where we have the free rent in the beginning as tenants move in. Our effective gross income is initially 0 because of that, although this will change by the end once we calculate our expense reimbursements. And then we keep going. Now, one criticism you could make of this formula for the base rental income at the top is that the third tenant doesn't move in until February 2019, the end of January 2019, really. So you could make the argument that our calculations here are a little bit deceptive and that we should be counting the fact that the third tenant space is unoccupied in the general vacancy. We should be including it in the base potential rental income at the top and then deducting it out and counting it as general vacancy. However, we don't view it that way. We view it as part of the lease-up period where the new tenants are coming in and we're releasing it out. It's not really general vacancy because the building is not stabilized yet. So we could potentially change that, but we don't think it's worth the time and effort here. And if you think about the impact, the result's the same. The effective gross income would still be the same even if we did that because the base rental income would be higher, but then the general vacancy deduction would also be a more negative number. This is what it looks like so far. Let's go down to our operating expenses now. For the recoverable expenses, let's do a check again to make sure that we're after the end of construction here. And if we are, then let's get our expenses and taxes per rentable square meter, the 40 pounds right here. We'll multiply by the rentable square meters in the property. We will divide by the months so that we convert this to an annual basis. You can see from the label here that this is pounds per square meter per year. And then we'll multiply by the expense inflation multiplier up here. And if we're not beyond the end of construction, we're just going to set this to 0. For the property management fees, it's pretty similar. We can do a check once again and make sure we're after construction is finished up. And if we are, we'll take our effective gross income and we'll multiply by the property management fee percentage, which is defined on the assumptions tab over here. And then for the reserves, once again, we need to check if we're after construction has finished. And if we are, then we take our replacement reserves right here, multiply by the rentable square meters, divide by the months in the year, and we multiply by that same expense inflation multiplier up there, and we have that. So I just copy these across, and so we have all of our expenses right here. That takes us to the end of part 1. So let's now go to part 2, the expense reimbursements. I already have the formula laid out right here because it's a little bit easier just to write it out, and then I'll copy and paste it in above for tenant number 1. We'll copy it down for tenant number 2, and I have some notes here explaining exactly what this is doing as well. But let's go up first and just paste in this formula. So with the first part, if F35 is greater than E46, F35 is just the date up here, and E46 is the lease start date. So we want to make sure that the lease has started. If the lease has not started, then clearly we cannot have any expense reimbursements because the tenant has not actually moved in yet. If that's true, then we will have expense reimbursements, and they'll be equal to these recoverable expenses, basically operating expenses, property taxes, and a few other items. Of course, we can't just take the whole number. We have to multiply by the percentage this tenant is occupying. So we take these rentable square meters in cell E45 and divide by the total rentable square meters, and that gives us the percentage. We could have also just taken the 41% here. It doesn't really matter. And then this next part may be a little bit confusing or may look a bit confusing. We multiply by 1, but we might reduce that as well. So in some cases, we will just multiply by 1. And in that case, the expense reimbursements will be exactly what I just stated. The recoverable expenses times the proportion of rentable square meters this tenant is occupying. But in some cases, if you look at what we're doing here, we're doing a check and we're comparing the current date to the lease expiration date. And we're also comparing the current date to the lease expiration date plus the number of downtime months. So this handles the case where we're at the lease expiration, the tenant does not renew, and we have to find a new tenant, and we have to spend 6 months or 9 months or 3 months or some other amount of time finding that new tenant. Now, if that is true, if the suite or the space here goes unoccupied for some period of time, then we're not going to have any expense reimbursements because there's no tenant there to actually pay them. So this is what this case is checking for. If that's true, then we have to take these expense reimbursements and we have to reduce them by multiplying by 1 minus the renewal probability. If that's not true, then this whole thing is just 0, and so this whole term just becomes 1, and we just have the normal expense reimbursements. Now, the reason why we're multiplying by 1 minus the renewal probability is described down here in my notes. If you think about the math for this, if we have 1 minus 60%, that simplifies to 1 minus 40%, which equals 60%, the renewal probability. We do that because there is a 40% non-renewal probability. So if we multiply the expense reimbursements by that 60%, effectively we reduce them by 40% to handle that non-renewal case. We're saying that in theory, we should be reimbursed for all these expenses, but in that 40% case where the tenant does not renew, we're going to assume that we lose 40% of those expense reimbursements. There might be some better ways to set this up and cleaner and smarter ways to do it, but this is just the first thing that we came up with in this time pressured scenario. So let's copy this over, and then let's copy it down for tenant number 2 as well. And of course, we don't need it for tenant number 3 because it's a gross lease. I'm also just quickly checking the math here to make sure that we're drawing on the correct formulas. Let's do a quick check to make sure that this is actually working correctly. We're not going to have anything when the lease first starts in May of 2018. So here, it looks like these are the full expense reimbursement amounts. And the reason we know that is because if we take the 41% right here and we multiply by the recoverable expenses in each period, it pretty much matches up to what we have below. So nothing too shocking there. We really want to go over to 2022 when the lease expires and see what happens then. So here, starting in May, we have 6 months of downtime. And if you look at the math for what we're doing in this case, we have the 41% times these recoverable expenses, but then we multiply by 60%. So we reduce it by 40% to account for that non-renewal case. And of course, if you look at the numbers, the anchoring is off here, but I think you get the idea. If you look at the numbers, they match up exactly to what we have for the expense reimbursements via our formula. So our manual calculations match our expense reimbursement formula down below. So that's how this works. It's very, very similar for the second tenant. The numbers go down from about $90,000 per month to $54,000 or $55,000 because of that same non-renewal probability. Now that we have that set up, we can also quickly look at how this affects our pro forma, especially when the building first starts operating. And we can see that now, in the first few months, our effective gross income is still very low, but we get some effective gross income solely because of these expense reimbursements. And so that's how it works here. And you can go across and look at the rest of it, but that is the main idea in this case. With that done, we are now finished with part 2. As always, I have some notes here, so you can look at these if you want a full breakdown of the formulas and more of a recap of what we did. Let's go to part 3 now and look at the NOI and adjusted NOI, which is pretty simple for the most part. The replacement reserves will be a little bit different here, but as I say in the notes, you should be able to do this in your sleep because it's almost exactly the same as what we've done in all the previous simplified case studies. Let's start by calculating the capital costs each year, and we'll take the tenant improvements for tenant number 1 and leasing commissions for tenant number 1. We'll take those same items for tenant number 2, and then we'll take them for tenant number 3 as well. And then for the replacement reserves, let's take the old balance right here. Let's factor in any additions. Remember that we're going to have an addition here that was set up in our debt and equity draw schedule above. So we take our replacement reserve right there, and then we go down and we factor in any additions on the property pro forma this year. Now, these are separate. These are considered part of the property's normal operations. They're not part of what the investor does in the beginning to fund this. So these are shown separately. We're using a negative sign because these appear with a negative on the pro forma, but of course they actually add to our reserve balance. And then we're going to subtract whatever we actually pay out from our reserves to pay for these capital costs each year. So we have that. We can copy these across. And then to calculate NOI, we'll take our effective gross income and subtract our operating expenses. Operating expenses already have a negative sign, so we actually added them here. Then we'll use an if error function, and we'll take our NOI and divide by our effective gross income and say NA if we don't have anything there. For the CapEx, TIs, and LCs, let's link up to our total capital costs right there. That'll be shown with a negative as well, so we can maintain the sign in that case. And then for the capital costs paid from the reserves, the formula is very similar to all the previous ones that we've looked at. We take the minimum between the capital costs in this month. We apply a negative sign to the CapEx, TIs, and LCs to turn that into a positive. And then we compare that to the replacement reserve in the previous month, plus the additions to the replacement reserve this month, plus anything allocated to these replacement reserves on the property pro forma in row 109. We have that. For the adjusted NOI, we can take our NOI and factor in both these items. We can add both these because they'll already have the appropriate signs, so we can just maintain those signs. And then for the adjusted NOI margin, we already have that set up. So let's copy this across now. And just to show you what this looks like, let's set up a frame at the top so we can see everything here a little bit better. So when the property first starts operating, we have a huge amount of capital costs, mostly because the leasing commissions and tenant improvements are all incurred right around then. Our NOI is negative because our operating expenses are so high. Our effective gross income is very low. Once we finish with 3 months of rent for those initial tenants, our NOI and adjusted NOI turn very positive. And in many of these months, the NOI and adjusted NOI are the same. The months that are different are the ones where we have capital costs, CapEx, TIs, and LCs that are not covered by the replacement reserves that we already have. And for the most part, we have replacement reserves sufficient to cover those in most of these months. So at least in the base case, it looks like the NOI and adjusted NOI here are never really different. They might be if we went beyond the end of this period, but at least in this one case, it seems like they're pretty much the same because of how much we're allocating to the reserves here. And with that, we are done with our monthly pro forma down to adjusted net operating income. Of course, we're not completely done with this because we haven't even looked at the debt yet. We'll do that next time around. And there's still more to finish. We still want to create an annual summary, but at least we have our monthly pro forma set up now. So let's do a recap and summary. In part one, we started with the monthly income and expenses, which were pretty easy because we've already calculated all of them. All we have to do is make sure that construction is actually finished. The only tricky part here is that for the base rental income, we have to factor in the fact that there is some unoccupied rentable space here. So we have to account for that, and then we have to subtract it out again in the general vacancy formula. The operating expenses are even simpler. We just check to make sure that we're past the end of construction, and then we bring in the values on a per rentable square meter basis or percentage of effective gross income basis. Then in part two, we went to the expense reimbursements and saw how essentially we just check to make sure that the lease has started. And if it has, and if we're dealing with a triple net lease tenant, we simply take the recoverable expenses and multiply by their proportional share. If we're in a period of downtime because of a non-renewal case when the lease expires, then we have to reduce it appropriately. And we do that by multiplying the expense reimbursements in that month by effectively the renewal probability, so that we reduce the expense reimbursements by the non-renewal probability. And then in part three, we calculated the NOI and adjusted NOI. You've already seen this formula many times. The only difference now is that we are adding to the replacement reserve from the debt and equity draws and that schedule above, whereas we did not quite do that before because the model was set up in a less flexible way. That's it for this lesson. Coming up next, we will turn our attention to the debt service and the debt projections in this model, and you will learn how the permanent loan refinancing works and how we can project the interest and principal repayments on that on a monthly basis over time.